Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture where we are going to look at the Apostle Paul. Of course, we're getting into Paul's writings, and within the canonical New Testament, there are 14 letters that are attributed to the Apostle Paul. Historians question half of that number, and one of them has essentially been completely removed as a Pauline letter, but I still, for traditional purposes, reference it as a Pauline letter. Anyway, kind of some points here with the Apostle Paul. He's born Jewish, as Saul in Tarsus, known as the Apostle of the Gentiles. He translated his first name to the Greek Paul. In the book of Acts, Paul does mention how he was born in Tarsus. His name's Saul, but the Greek version is Paul. Apostle of the Gentiles. In fact, his gospel was very, very, very appealing to them, particularly as I mentioned in the lecture over the book of Acts, with the God-fearers, these individuals who were Gentiles, non-Jews, but they held that the God of the Jews, the God of Abraham, was the one true God, but they would not go fully embrace Judaism because that would involve circumcision. But Paul, in his particular gospel, stated, well, you don't have to do that. And that was very, very appealing to them. Um, Paul was a member of the Pharisaic movement within Judaism, and he was originally a persecutor of the church. Paul writes about this in his own letters. He doesn't really state, what he completely did that was so like particular examples of persecution. I guess that's because, obviously he had moved beyond that. Um, in the book of Acts, Luke mentions Paul being present at the stoning of Saint Stephen, but Paul doesn't mention anything about that in his own writings. But he does, of course, mention that he was part of the Pharisaic movement within Judaism and that he was a persecutor of the Christian faith. While he was not originally part of Jesus' earthly ministry, obviously, he was a persecutor of it, Paul emerged to be the second most important leader of the early Christian community after Peter. So, Paul, he wasn't part of Jesus' earthly ministry at all. And in fact, when it started, he was a persecutor of it. But he ended up becoming the second most important leader of the early Christian community after Peter. Um, some historians think, and this will be referenced in this lecture, that Paul took what Jesus started and took it in a direction that Jesus perhaps may not have approved of. Certainly, those within the early Christian community who disagreed with Paul, like the adoptionists slash Ebionites, they would certainly say that Paul took the movement in a manner that Jesus would not approve of. Of the early Christian leaders, Paul was arguably the best educated. Paul certainly had training at a rabbinical school, so he definitely was the best educated of the early Christian leaders. He's often been considered a second founder or co-founder of Christianity. And this is something that I touched on earlier, that many historians think that Paul took something that Jesus started, but took it in a manner, in a direction that Jesus may not have personally agreed with. Really, the big issue would be Paul's attitude regarding the Jewish Torah, the law, which, of course, for the Jewish people, that is the most important portion of their scriptures, the first five books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And along with St. Peter, Paul is considered the co founder of the bishopric, the Diocese of Rome. So the Bishop of Rome, whom we commonly refer to as the Pope, is recognized as the successor of Saints Peter and Paul. As I'm recording this, the current Bishop of Rome, Leo the 14th, is recognized as the 267th successor of Saints Peter and Paul. While there are no contemporary portraits of Paul, there is a written description of him within 100 years after his death. This comes from the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And I mentioned that work, that it was written by a presbyter, a priest, who wrote this particular letter that's known as Third Corinthians, which in many respects deals with Gnosticism, but it was essentially a forgery. The presbyter slash priest who wrote it did so, as Tertullian stated, out of his love for Paul, but he ended up being deposed, and I would say that means that he was stripped of his priestly duties. But that doesn't mean that everything within that particular work is a complete forgery, because a lot of what that presbyter, whomever he was, based that work on certainly would have been oral history. And within a 100-year period, that he writes a description of Paul is probably pretty close to what Paul looked like. And I'm going to read some of this. And a man named Onesiphorus, who had heard that Paul was come to Iconium, went out with his children, Simmias and Zeno, and his wife Lectra, to meet Paul, that he might receive him to his house. For Titus had told him what Paul looked like, for hitherto he had not seen him in the flesh, but only in the spirit. And he went along the royal road, which leads to Lystra, and stood there waiting for him, and looked at all who came according to Titus's description. And he saw Paul coming, a man small of stature, with a bald head and crooked legs, in a good state of body, with eyebrows meeting, and a nose somewhat hooked, full of friendliness, for now he appeared like a man, and now he had the face of an angel. And the portrait that I have down here at the bottom is one of the earliest portraits of Paul, and the particular image there does fit the written description. To say something else about Paul and his physical description, in Galatians, Paul mentions trouble with his eyes, and a lot of modern medical historians, I mean, we can only speculate, of course, but a lot of modern medical historians think that Paul might have suffered from glaucoma. And along with St. Peter, Paul was executed in Rome during Nero's persecution of Christians during the years of 64 to 67 CE/AD. Peter ended up getting crucified. The tradition is that he was crucified upside down in Nero's circus in Rome. Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, was given a more humane sentence, and that is he was beheaded. And where he was beheaded would have been near where the church, St. Paul outside the walls, is currently standing, which was built over the grave of Paul. Look a little bit here at Paul, the author. Traditionally, Paul is recognized as the author of 14 canonical books of the New Testament. I mentioned that at the start of this lecture, but I also mentioned that historians question half of that number. And one of the works that they question has almost been completely removed as a Pauline letter. But in any case, here are the undisputed letters of Paul that everyone holds he's the author of. You have Romans, Galatians, First Thessalonians, First and Second Corinthians, Philippians, and Philemon. And then among the disputed letters, you have Ephesians, Colossians, Second Thessalonians, the pastorals, which is First and Second Timothy and Titus, and the letter to the Hebrews. And Hebrews has essentially been completely removed as a Pauline letter. To say something about the letter to the Hebrews, even though I traditionally place it among the disputed letters, but it's basically been completely removed, even among your very conservative historians. And this was something questionable, or the letter being authored by Paul was questionable even in the early centuries of Christianity, where Christians basically convinced themselves that Paul was the author. But mentioning about the letter to the Hebrews being completely removed as a Pauline letter, I belong to a liturgical tradition, and I can remember during the scripture readings that the lector, would come up to the podium. I can remember as a teenager him or her stating, a reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Hebrews. Now, when Hebrews is read, the lector just simply states, a reading from the letter to the Hebrews. Paul's name has been completely removed. But the main thesis of Paul's theology is that the death of Christ does away with the Jewish Torah/law. And this comes out in a number of Paul's letters. But essentially, this was arguably the earliest major controversy in the Christian religion because the Torah, the law, is the most important portion of the Hebrew scriptures for Jews. The 613 commandments, which modern day Jews cannot follow because a lot of them relate to the temple system and there is no longer a temple. But, Paul essentially stating how that circumcision thing that we've been doing for, at this point, would have been, say, 1800 years. We don't need to do that anymore. That to come into the covenant with the Abrahamic God, we just need to take some water, pour it over your head, and recite a few words. You can see how that perhaps would have been a controversial issue for that time. Well, that is our quick, brief introduction to Paul. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Till then, take care.